everybody. I'm Dr. Shyla Murgain, a health and sports psychologist at UW Health. Thank you so much for joining me today. This is our first Facebook Live discussion. We're so excited to have all of you tuning in live and those of you who will be following up later. And if you do have questions for me during this discussion, feel free to type those into the comments section and I'll make time at the end to answer some of those. But today's topic is, right now it's February, it's Heart Health Month, and we're really promoting a lot of awareness about heart disease. And I want to talk to you about the importance of decreasing that sense of loneliness and social connection as really being a key aspect of having that healthy heart. When I think about this topic, I think about a woman that I know named Stacy who was recently diagnosed with heart disease. And she was going through cardiac rehabilitation after having a stent placed. And she was doing all those heart-healthy things like exercising, changing her nutrition to a heart-healthy diet. And she was managing stress through a variety of different mind-body strategies. But when she learned about the impact that isolation can have on health, she realized this was an area she really had to address. Studies show that isolation and loneliness can actually be a contributing factor to mortality. Between 26 to 29% of people who are really isolated and lonely can have an increased risk of mortality. And what's interesting about this is that loneliness can be comparable to risk factors for mortality like smoking, poor health, poor mental health, lack of exercise. And when we think about heart disease, we're finding some of those same statistics, that those people who are chronically lonely and very isolated also have about a 30% increased risk of heart disease and stroke. So when Stacy found this out, she realized that this was an area she really had to prioritize. As I said, she was newly diagnosed with a heart issue, and so she was actively involved in medical care, which left her less time for really doing some of those social things with her friends. She was currently going through a separation with her spouse, and her children were nearing those college-age years, so were less available. And Stacy found that she was feeling on her own. She started to feel like those support systems of her family and some of those friends were less available. And it hurt. And it's interesting that when we look at what the brain does when we're feeling that sense of loneliness, some of the same parts of the brain light up as when we're actually in physical pain. So that sense of loneliness can really hurt. It's that feeling that we have that, I don't have that kind of connection that I'm longing for. So Stacy really wanted to turn this around, and she did a couple different things that I want to talk to you about. She realized when she was lonely, she was actually more vulnerable to stress. And there was an interesting study that looked at animals, and they found that when an animal was on its own and experienced stress, it had an increase of 50% increase in plasma cortisol. However, when that animal was around familiar companions and that same stressor was given to that animal, with those familiar companions around him, we don't see any rise in cortisol. So what does that mean when we think about heart health and health in general? When we're surrounded by people that we feel close with, that are confidants, that we feel connected to, it actually can help buffer us from stress. So social support, decreasing that sense of isolation, it's so important. A recent poll by a Harris poll, a recent survey, found that about a third of people experience loneliness about once a week. So Stacy wasn't alone. Now, she did a couple different things that I really encourage all of you to think about. And the first was something that I call don't shoot the second arrow. Stacy, as I said, she was kind of struggling. She felt like that loneliness was like a deep ache in her heart. And what she was starting to do was she was starting to turn that inward. So if we think about the first arrow is just that sense of feeling on our own and alone. The second arrow starts to happen when we confuse that feeling with it being a fact. So she felt lonely, but it wasn't a fact that she was all alone. It was a feeling, not a fact. So one of the things she did to not shoot that second arrow was that she decided, I'm going to not blame myself. She'd gotten into a pattern that I think it's very common for people to start to blame themselves or feel embarrassed or start to say, oh, maybe there's something wrong with me. So a lot of negative self-criticism. Or sometimes we see people start to have negative attributions about others. Oh, those people over there whispering, maybe they're talking about me, or maybe they don't like me. When we get into that kind of second arrow, or starting to blame ourselves or being distrustful of others when we feel lonely, that can leave us vulnerable to more chronic loneliness and more isolation. So instead, Stacey said, gosh, this isn't, it's a state, it's kind of this fact of life right now, but there's something that I can do about it. So the second thing that she did is she reached out and connected, and in particular had this motto of, I'm going to be the sun in somebody's gloomy day. And she realized that the friends that she had, she was kind of changing and growing, and that she needed to seek out new connections. And that the people that she had surrounded herself with maybe were great for a certain phase of her life, but currently she didn't feel like they were necessarily part of her tribe. And so that becoming that sunshine in somebody's gloomy day, she recognized there are a variety of opportunities to connect with people. For example, she reached out, and when she, at work, she would just be friendlier and smile and ask people how their day was and follow up about particular concerns that she heard. She ended up joining a class. She really wanted to reclaim some of her creativity, so she went to an art class and started to introduce herself and get to know some of the women and men in that art class. And she also decided, one of the best things I can do when I'm feeling lonely is to get outside of myself. And so she started to volunteer to figure out, how can I make a difference? And that really helped her feel that sense of connection with her community. And then lastly, one of the things that Stacey did is she recognized there are going to be times that I feel alone. It's going to happen, and it doesn't have to necessarily be a bad thing. And so the last thing that she did was she learned how to generate her own warmth. That when she was on her own, she realized she had to become more comfortable in her own skin and to enjoy her own company. And she did one meditation that I think can be quite helpful, and one practice, that in those moments where she felt that sense of disconnection, she felt a little bit isolated, she brought to mind memories of all the people who had been kind to her over her life. Those small things, those big things, those random acts of kindness, those strangers, those companions, those friends, those relatives who had invested something in her. And when she brought that to mind, she was actually kind of flooded with memories and felt that sense that really life loved her. Even though this was a difficult time, even though at times she felt alone, although it was a difficult time, difficult moment, it wasn't the only moment. And she felt like she could carry those memories of all those people and all those moments of kindness with her. It actually gave her courage when she went out and tried to meet new people, and it certainly kind of soothed some of that ache and hurt in those difficult times. So when we're thinking about loneliness, we can think about loneliness as really a helper. It can motivate us. The discomfort of it can motivate us to take action and connect, to strengthen the relationships that we currently have, maybe reaching out and scheduling something with a friend or loved one or relative, maybe talking to somebody, just an acquaintance that you don't know very well, and see if you can strengthen that relationship. And I always say it pays to really keep working on our relationships, because over time friendships go, family members we're closer to, or there's more distance. And so that loneliness can really spur us into action, sometimes it's courage work, to take those steps to meet new people and expand our support base. So when we think about loneliness as that kind of helpful cue, we remember during those times we don't want to shoot the second arrow or start to blame ourselves or get distrustful of others. Second, we can reach out and connect and be the sunshine in somebody else's day, gloomy day. And third, learning to generate our own warmth by remembering all those times that people have been kind to us and have connected with us. And I think that it can also prompt us. So many people in our communities and around us are lonely, so it can help us go the extra mile. And lastly, I just want to encourage you that sometimes loneliness, when it becomes chronic, can turn into clinical depression. So if you find that you're lonely, you're starting to feel down, you're getting stuck in a rut, or you're starting to isolate even more, really encourage you to reach out to your medical provider to talk about it. That can really help get you the kind of treatment and those kind of resources that could really help turn it around. So I'd love to take questions or comments from viewers right now. And I know that there was one that came in earlier from James, who asked, can you talk about the difference between loneliness and being alone? James, that's a great question, because oftentimes I think they can be confused. Many people are more introverted and find that they actually really need alone time to recharge, to refuel, and they really savor those moments alone and sometimes feel like I don't have enough white space, I don't have enough of that alone time in my life. So being alone is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is different in that it is really that sense, that kind of connection, that companionship that I'm longing for, those close confidants. I don't have enough of it, or I'm found lacking in some way. Because probably you can all appreciate, we can have all these Facebook friends or Instagram followers or acquaintances, but we can sometimes feel the most alone in the mix of lots of people. Because often the antidote for loneliness is having, even if it's one person or a couple people, that really get us and understand us, where we feel safe, where we feel heard, and we get that sense of connection that can be helpful. So we have another question from Jane, which says, is this similar to broken heart syndrome? Great question, Jane. And I would say, although there's some similarities, there are some differences. Broken heart syndrome is related to heart disease, that when somebody goes through a really significant loss or some life trauma, that can trigger that incident, for example, a heart attack. Usually that tends to be more of a complicated, stressful life event. Versus loneliness, although can be that risk factor for heart disease, it's not usually just one episode of loneliness that's going to then trigger the heart issue. But great question. And I will also say that sometimes people find that sense of connection in things other than human interaction. I have a lot of people that talk about their pets, give them that sense of feeling loved and supported. Or many people will take that walk in nature and feel connected to something larger than themselves. So lots of different ways to really get that social connection. And Becky has a question, thanks Becky, and says, how to encourage a friend who who thinks that he or she is lonely. Well, Becky, it sounds like that person's really lucky to have you as a friend. And that would be a person I just encourage you to reach out to. And anyone listening, there are probably people in your life that you know that person's going through a tough time or maybe a life change. And maybe just one small action of a phone call or an email or even an in-person interaction where you reach out and say, hey, really, how are you doing? Really, I want to hear. So I think that's the first thing, Becky, is to reach out to that person and tell them that you care, you're concerned. I would actually also encourage during those, if you're face-to-face, to put those smartphones away. There was a study that showed something called the iPhone effect, that when we're connected in person with somebody, having a conversation, the mere presence of a smartphone, actually when that, even if it's off and just on the table or in your hand, actually lowered that sense of connection in that interaction. So Becky, put those smartphones away, and then I would encourage you to maybe even share this interview with your friend and maybe brainstorm with him or her what are some things that she could do or join where she would be able to meet some new people. So what kinds of activities could she reach out to and join? And I do want to mention, sometimes people feel really nervous when they're going into those social situations. So there's a really cool study out of UC Berkeley where they came up with a list of questions that were meant to be done in 45 minutes, and it's called the Fast Friends Protocol. If you Google it, Fast Friends Protocol out of UC Berkeley. They had two strangers come together and ask these questions for 45 minutes. And what was so neat about it, after these questions were answered, people felt significantly close, like this is my new best friend. They're great questions to even use for those of you who are single and going out on a date. So you might, Becky, even encourage your friend to try one of those questions in that social situation and see if that might help lower some of that anxiety sometimes we have when we go into those new social situations. Great. Pang says, can depression cause memory loss? Oh, that's a great question, Pang. And a lot of times people, when they think about loneliness, it is actually one of those symptoms of depression. Depression doesn't necessarily cause memory loss, but memory loss, some of those cognitive changes can happen when we start to experience depression. So one of the symptoms of depression is we have some concentration problems, some memory difficulties. We're not able to retain information or recall information in that same way. However, we don't diagnose depression with just that symptom criteria. Depression is diagnosed when we feel really down, most of the day, nearly every day, or we've lost interest or pleasure in things, and that symptom, those two symptoms, one or the other, persistent for at least 2 weeks, most of the day, nearly every day. Sometimes memory difficulties can be related to lots of other things, not necessarily depression. It could be sleep disturbance, it could be even just aging, for example, or even related to a particularly stressful time. So we're going to see if there are any other questions. Great. Beth says, are there books or resources you recommend? Well, the first resource I want to recommend is that UW Health has an e-newsletter, and we're going to be sharing the link to it in this Facebook Live in the comments section. And I'm going to be writing an article with our UW Health editor about this topic. And so if I didn't get to any of your questions, or you realize that you have some additional questions afterwards, feel free to put those in the comment and we'll try to address them in the article. So I think that would be a great resource, is the UW Health e-newsletter. And there are just a lot of books right now about well-being, about how to thrive in your life. So you could look at some of those as well. Great, and we're going to see if there are any other questions. Great. Ariel says, if you have a family history, do you need, let's just see, we're writing it down here, bear with us. Okay. If you have a family history, do you need to pay attention to loneliness? Wonderful question. So, and I actually had somebody earlier today ask me, oh, you know, my mom is aging, and I'm starting to worry about her social support system as friends are dying or moving away, getting less and less. So sometimes we can find that, you know, we're worried about family members, and then we start to worry about ourselves. And I just encourage, you know, for this question about, I have a family history, should I be worried? You could think about maybe things that your parents didn't do or your relatives didn't do as they age, that might have left them more isolated. Around age 30 and 50, we find those are the two times some research suggests we're the most vulnerable to loneliness. They tend to co-occur with some developmental changes, such as in around age 30, maybe entering the world of work, getting married, less time for friends. Age 50, sometimes we get into the empty nest syndrome as kids are leaving home, going to college. So I would say that when we have those particular times, or we see those family members, we can be proactive. We don't have to wait until we're lonely to seek action and really build that support base. We could think about even doing one thing each week that we're reaching out and working on our social support network. Probably many of you are going to the gym once a week or twice a week. You could think about in the same way, once a week I'm going to do something proactive to build that social support network. And for those family members, or an aging parent, connecting them maybe just with a group that they can meet with weekly. I would encourage that as well. It's not something we necessarily prioritize, but can be helpful. So Angie says, in our plugged-in world, do you have strategies for a good mix of face-to-face versus social media? That is, thank you so much, Angie, for bringing that up. Because I think part of why we're seeing our social connections diminishing and dwindling, that those really close confidants, we find, studies suggest in the last couple decades, those social networks have decreased by a third, that we're spending so much time plugged in and connecting this way, via email or text or Snapchat or social media, that we've lost the simple pleasure of a face-to-face conversation. So what I would say to you, Angie, is that, all these wonderful ways of staying connected digitally, don't let it replace the face-to-face, because I think that's really where the health benefit comes in, that there's something about sitting with somebody and talking and seeing their facial expressions and listening in that more intimate way that provides those health benefits that I talked about earlier, of lowering, blood pressure, boosting our immune system, helping us have that healthier, happier heart. So yes, so really I encourage people to prioritize this. Okay, so Joseph says, depression, how can depression affect the heart if there's a history of heart issues in the family history? And certainly we find there can, for depression, be a genetic factor, and depression can be one of those risk factors for heart disease, and even for poor outcomes for people who do have heart disease. And although we can't really pinpoint the exact causation, it's more of a association or correlation. One of the thoughts around how it can be related is that when we are depressed and we're not getting the right kind of treatment or intervention for it, we can start to not take care of ourselves. We can, start to socially isolate. We can not eat as well. We can turn to those kind of junk foods. We can become more sedentary, that leading to those poor health habits then can lead us to really be kind of at risk for heart disease and other medical conditions. Okay, so I think we have one more question coming in, so thanks so much for all of these. But and as I said, a great resource is the UW Health e-newsletter, and we should be having our article coming out probably in the next week or two. So Marite says, is it possible people don't have the level of intimacy in relationships and thus feel lonely? Yeah, I bet a lot of people can really appreciate that question. Thanks so much for asking that. I think that we live in really, I would say, quite busy times where many people have a lot on their plate, juggling work and family demands and even all our social media friends, that there often is less time available for those deeper connections. And we can sometimes feel like, well, I'll just invest this small amount of time in in my social network, but not necessarily achieve the benefits of deep intimacy and going into that place of close connection where we're fully seen and heard. And sometimes that requires a bit of vulnerability to really share all of who we are. And I find when I think back to that story I was telling about Stacy and her having to find her tribe, it took her a while until she found that kind of her tribe of those people that she felt were really simpatico, or those people who were her heart friends, so to speak, where she felt like they appreciated her for who she was. They did make the effort, they did invest the time, they had similar values. And I think when we find those people, we want to hold on to them for life. You know, those are those companions that we want throughout all the phases and stages. And so I think, you know, part of, cultivating those connections with others is also about cultivating that connection with ourselves, that the more we can really love ourselves and take care of ourselves and really value the unique contribution that each and every one of us has to make, the more we can do that, then the more we have to offer others, and I think the more kind of openness we can greet others and help really form those really solid, strong bonds. Okay, well thank you. I think that's a great question to end on. I will be back in a month, and I would love for you to join me for my next UW Health Facebook Live event. It'll be in a month, Thursday, March 9th. At 3:45 again, so please tune in. We'll be talking about a really interesting topic that I like to call the Phoenix Rising phenomenon, like a phoenix rising from the ashes, of how we can use challenging, difficult times really to be a catalyst for tremendous growth as we move in the direction of our potentials. So I would love for you to join me then and there, and thanks so much for being part of our first ever UW Health Facebook Live. Have a great day, everyone, and go forth and connect with somebody this week.